I recommend you master as though your music were going to be released on vinyl. At this point, we have optimized the level, the loudness, we've optimized the EQ, we've balanced the dynamics, found the loudness sweet spot, the perfect balance of loudness and dynamics. So we're done, right? Well, not quite yet, because if you remember in that first video, my third explanation of what mastering was the simple, dry, technical one that it is providing an optimized production master for the destination format. And that's what we're going to talk about in this video, because back in the day, that meant vinyl, cassette, CD. These days, it's more likely to mean download or an online streaming service. But there are still lots of factors to take into consideration to make sure you get the best possible results, that the sound that you've decided on in mastering makes it through to the final listener. And that's what we're going to talk about in this video. So we're going to talk about file formats, we're going to talk about the optimal loudness for the streaming platforms and how the loudness of your songs might be affected by those, and also the metadata, all of the information that needs to be included with your files, particularly for online distribution. But before we get into all of that, I just want to show you one more detail about the mastering decisions that I've made for these songs. And if you were paying attention in the last video, you might have spotted it. There's an extra process on Another Day Calling and Widow, which is the stereo enhancer plugin. Now, I had it disabled last time, but I'm going to enable it this time and just show you quickly what's happening. So we start with Another Day Calling, and you can see I've got a 20% increase on the stereo width. This is using Steinberg's built-in stereo enhancer plugin. It has some extra options, but I don't really tend to use those. And it's a very straightforward increase of the side signal, the difference signal in the music, so the sound at the edges of the stereo image. And I've done exactly the same thing for Widow, except I only have a 10% increase there. So let me show you how those sound. We'll start with Another Day Calling. It works really nicely. It just opens out the sound of the song a little bit, gives a little bit more depth and space in the mix. You do need to be careful with this kind of processing. It's easy to go too far, to get carried away. But the nice thing about it is that if you hit mono, you're not going to hear any strange phasing or comb filtering artifacts. Of course, you're going to hear a bigger difference between the stereo and mono version than you would have done beforehand, but there's always going to be a big difference there anyway, and I think it's worthwhile for people who are listening in stereo. So let me play you the same thing for Widow. But you play with it. I don't want the street to claim your last sweet breath. Babe, I know that it's a rush to do what you do. Stay, won't you stay with me? But I can make it up to you. 'Cause I can be your queen, and I can be your slave. And you can hear there, the biggest difference is with the backing vocals in that. There's an interesting contrast in this mix. A lot of it is very focused in the center until the vocals come in. So you just get a subtle opening out effect most of the time, and then the backing vocals come in, and it just really adds a nice little extra excitement for me. Now, of course, this isn't the kind of thing you're going to do with every song. I haven't added it in this case to Promises and Lies, although we did have a little bit of side-only EQ enhancement on that song, remember. And all of these songs were mixed by Mike, and it's possible that my taste differs from his slightly in this respect. And I would say that this is very much a case of taste rather than requirement for an adjustment like this. But it's a nice option to have at your disposal, and there are other things, other more subtle effects you can add in mastering sometimes. But as I've said all along, 80 to 90% of the heavy lifting is done with the compression and the EQ on all of these songs. And these more esoteric processes are very much the icing on the cake. So now we're at the position where we can listen to all of these changes together. I've said all the way through that on their own, each of these changes, the EQ, the compression, the dynamics, and the stereo width, are quite subtle, but they add up to more than that. And the easiest way to hear that comparison is to just disable everything at once if your DAW allows you to. I can do that here in Wavelab, so let's try that with each of these songs. And immediately we hear yet again the loudness deception. There's a noticeable drop in level there, even though the majority of the level increases here have been made using the clip gain function. We do have that, 2 dB increase, and that change is going to outweigh any other differences we might hear. Let me just demonstrate that to you quickly, and then I'll compensate for that change. So that sounds like quite a big change, obviously, and that's understandable. But what we need to do is add temporarily an extra gain utility here and to correct for that overall change. And I've actually measured this song with and without the processing from beginning to end to come up with an overall loudness change of 1.6 dB. So I've just added that after all the other processing. It's actually before the limiter, but the limiter is working very gently, so it's not going to make a huge amount of difference in this case. So let's see how it sounds now when I disable all that processing with the gains matched. And now we can make a more realistic, a more pragmatic assessment of the changes to that song. Obviously, we can still hear a difference. You know, the EQ and the compression that we've chosen in there has enhanced the sound of the song, even after the loudness has been balanced before and after. But when we're not hearing that big loudness change, we can assess much more fairly whether we like the changes. Let's try the same thing with Another Day Calling. And in this case, the gain change was 2.8 dB. And again, we can hear how nicely that's working. The extra richness and depth in the bass, the opening out of the stereo spectrum. The song sounds better even when the loudness is matched, and that is always the goal. The interesting thing about making this comparison is that sometimes when you do it, you realize that actually it doesn't sound quite as good, or perhaps you've gone a little bit too far with one or more of the processes once you loudness match them, and that's valuable information to have. So let's do exactly the same comparison for Widow, in which case the adjustment is 1.5 dB. And remember, there's a much bigger overall adjustment because of these extra clip gain changes that we've made. These are just compensating for the processing that's been placed on the clip here.
But you play with death. I don't want the street to claim your last sweet breath. Stay, babe, I know that it's a rush to do what you do. Stay, won't you stay with me? But I can make it up to you. 'Cause I can be your queen, and I can be your slave. I'll give you whatever you ask for.
And again, with the loudness removed, the changes are quite subtle, but I think still worthwhile. Let me just remind you of how much difference it makes if you don't adjust for that loudness.
I don't want the street to claim your last sweet breath. Stay.
And again, even a difference of as small as 1.5 dB can completely change our perception of the changes. And most of the processing that I've used has been pretty subtle and fairly light-handed on these songs. But this process of double checking with loudness compensation is particularly valuable if you're applying more aggressive processing. So that was just a temporary change. Let's quickly remove those now to go back to the chosen levels. And the final check that I like to do at this stage is to actually, again, make a gain change, but this time on the master output, so it affects all of the songs that we're listening to. I find it helpful to listen at a dimmed level of roughly minus 12 dB. It completely changes sometimes our perception of the song. So let's take a listen like that. So I've just turned everything down by 12 dB. I just like to flick between reasonably similar sections in terms of loudness of the different songs. And actually, interestingly enough, I think possibly these two songs are a little bit loud in comparison to Promises and Lies, bearing in mind that Promises and Lies is a full ahead rock song. So I'm just going to experiment with pulling the gain back slightly. Let's reduce the gain there on Another Day Calling and pull them back just by half a dB. That might seem like splitting hairs, but it's amazing what difference little changes like this can make, especially when you add them up over the course of a whole playlist or album, or even just a collection of songs. Let's see how that feels back at the full mastering level. Those are working really well together now. I'm really happy with the way those songs balance each other and work against each other. They're not matched, they don't sound the same, but they sound cohesive. They sound like they belong together. They sound intentional. That's the goal of mastering. And as I've said all the way through, little changes like this at every stage in the process. You know, you adjust the gain, then you think again. You adjust the EQ, and you listen again. You adjust the dynamics, and you listen again. And then in this case, we made some tweaks to the stereo processing, and we listen again. And at every stage, you hone in over repeated listens to hopefully the ideal result. And one final point I want to make is that you've only seen me listen to brief excerpts of all of these songs. Of course, when I was deciding on the settings for them, I did listen to the songs from beginning to end. I do that with any real mastering job, and you should too. And having made these final decisions, this is also the perfect time to add track IDs for the starts and end of songs, fine-tune the crossfades, and also adjust the gaps. Now, all of these tweaks and subtleties are all very well in the mastering application, but the real question is, how are they going to sound in the real world? And increasingly in the 21st century, that means how will they sound online? Something like 85 to 90% of music industry revenue in the US in 2017 even came from non-physical formats, so that means downloads and streaming. And that trend is only going to continue as time goes on. So the reality is people are likely to hear music for the first time, especially on YouTube, Spotify, Tidal, and the other streaming services. And there are two factors that make the way they hear it there different from what we hear in the mastering application. One of those things is the data compressed encoding, so MP3, AAC, OGG, all the streaming codecs that are used to reduce bandwidth. And the other one is loudness. And since we've just been talking about loudness, let's deal with that one first. Streaming services are turning loud music down to stop users being blasted by sudden changes in level. And that means that if your songs are mastered loud, people will not necessarily hear them at that same level. Now, that doesn't matter hugely because the same thing is being done to all songs, but it is valuable to experiment and check that your music still sounds good in that situation. So to do that, we need to match the playback loudness. And you could use a loudness meter, but it's probably quicker to export all of the files and use those instead. And that then makes it really quick and easy to import and measure the loudness of each song. And these are the results you get when you do that. Notice that they're not all the same, and that's exactly as we expected when we talked about loudness in episode 3. Another Day Calling has a lower overall value than the other two songs because it has more dynamic variety, whereas Promises and Lies is consistently loud all the way through and has a higher overall loudness value than the other two. So now, in order to preview the way that those would sound online, you simply need to adjust them all to the same loudness. It makes sense to choose the level used by the platform you're interested in. Right now, for example, when this video is being made, YouTube, Tidal and Amazon are all using -14 LUFS as their reference level. But don't get hung up on that number. It's not a target and it could change at any time. The goal is simply to hear the songs in comparison to similar reference material at the reference loudness and make sure that you're happy with the way that it sounds then. And for example, if you pushed the loudness very hard when you were mastering and your song gets turned down a long way, you might find that actually when the loudness is matched with a more dynamic master, it doesn't sound as good as you might expect. It might sound reined in or held back by the restricted dynamics. Normalization is a complicated beast though, and all of the different streaming services currently use slightly different rules, slightly different methods, and slightly different reference levels, which is why I created the loudness penalty website with meter plugs. You just drag and drop a file, and the browser calculates how much the level will be adjusted on the different platforms, and crucially allows you to preview the results to see whether you're happy with the result. And as I mentioned, the second way that streaming services can affect the way people hear the music we master is by encoding it to different file formats to save data when streaming. More sophisticated versions of the MP3 codecs we're all used to. And you could simply test your files by encoding them to the format of your choice and comparing them with the originals. But there are various options available these days that will do that for you in real time. Wavelab includes an encoder checker. We can select the different file formats that we're interested in previewing. We can flick between them and we can even blind test ourselves on the results. Now, this is a rabbit hole that I would advise you to avoid going too far down, because at the end of the day, just like the reference levels, The codecs that the platforms are using are subject to change without notice, and we really don't have any control over the quality of the files that they produce. But it is another thing that you might be interested in investigating. What you do about it is entirely up to you. My recommendation is to not be too concerned about the changes made by the codecs, by the encoders for AAC or whatever file format. The changes are pretty subtle, with the possible exception of mobile platforms. And those things are going to improve over time anyway. We already have several completely lossless services coming, and I think as bandwidth improves in the coming years, that's going to become the norm. Loudness is a bit trickier. I certainly don't think it's worth going as far as trying to create separate masters for different platforms, though. In fact, most aggregators will only accept a single file for submission. And if you follow the guidelines that I've laid out in these videos, your masters can sound great on any of the streaming platforms anyway. And one more technicality to mention is the peak level of the file. Remember, this doesn't really have anything to do with the loudness, but it is important for another reason. And I've recommended several times during these videos that you keep the true peak level of your audio to no higher than -1 dB. We can see why that is by using the encoder checker again. I have -1 dB set in the limiter there, and you'll see that the limiter is controlling the peaks to make sure that's not exceeded. But if I switch over to an encoded result, especially at the low bandwidth of mobile phones, the peaks start going above -1. And that's because of the heavy processing that's applied during the encoding and decoding process to this lossy format. Now, the true peak measurement aims to try and anticipate those changes, and some people will tell you that true peaks up to 0 are therefore safe. But you can see from this example here, even though my mastered song is not super loud by modern standards, the true peaks are getting very close to 0 after that low bandwidth signal is decoded. And that's why I recommend playing it safe and giving yourself a dB of true peak headroom. So finally, we need to talk about the actual format of the files you're going to send. And I can actually sum that up very quickly and clearly. I recommend you send lossless 16-bit 44.1 files to everywhere except for vinyl manufacturing and platforms that specifically request higher resolution files. The reasons for that are pretty straightforward. It needs to be lossless because it's going to be encoded anyway. Some people ask whether it's better to supply files in the format that's going to be used by a particular streaming service. And in theory, there might be some advantage to that, but in practice, there's a real risk that things will be encoded again. And lossy data compression is such an aggressive process to carry out on the audio. You really don't want it to happen twice. It's a minor miracle that it sounds as decent as it does the first time. In terms of the bit depth and sample rate, modern encoders are capable of accepting higher bit depth files and in some cases higher sample rates as well, but most aggregators at this point are still requesting 1644. And given that, personally, I prefer to do the final downsampling and bit depth reduction myself so that I have complete control over the process. The only exception to that, as I say, is services which require higher definition files like Tidal, Quobuzz, HD Tracks, and Apple Digital Masters. And in that case, I simply follow the guidelines of that particular service. One final point is to make sure when you're reducing to 16-bit files that you use dither. Some audio software does that by default, but if you're given a choice, make sure you tick the box. Mastering for vinyl is an art form all of its own, and I would certainly recommend, if you're planning to get vinyl made, that you have a dedicated cutting engineer who sends you a test pressing and you can have a conversation with them about what's going to be best for the material. But again, if you follow the guidelines that I've set out in this series of videos, your music is going to be in great shape for vinyl. The only thing that you might like to do is remove the final limiter. It's not possible to cut super hot vinyl without damaging the lathe, so you should always ask the engineer to optimize the level for you. If you're going to have CDs pressed, there is a specific master file format called the Disk Description Protocol, DDP image. Wavelab has support for DDP built in. There are other standalone applications that allow you to export DDPs, and if you are going to do that, you need to make sure that you have all of the metadata for the project in place. That's fairly limited in the case of DDP. It's basically the album title, artist name, and song titles. You can see there's also a lot of other information that can be added. One word of caution, though, is that typically if you're uploading to an aggregator to distribute the files online, that information is unlikely to be taken from the files themselves. You'll probably have to enter that information as text during the submission process, so it's probably not worth going to too much effort in your DAW. One of the things that I like about Wavelab is the flexibility and speed for exporting in a whole range of different formats for different platforms if that's necessary. I only have to enter the data once, which is great. However you do it, make sure you include the track number of the songs at the start of the title if they're intended to be released in a particular running order, and also make sure that the gaps that you want are included at the ends of the files so it sounds right when they're listened to in sequence. So I'm aware that we've covered quite a lot of ground in this video. There's quite a lot of different topics and it might seem a little bit confusing. So I want to just try and summarize what I think are the 4 most important points. The first one is that one master really can rule them all. There's no need to supply separate masters for all the different streaming platforms, for CD, for file formats. The one possible exception is you might want to remove that final limiter if you're supplying for vinyl manufacturing. The second point is that 16-bit 44.1 really is a great distribution format. If you're supplying to a service that requires high definition files, or again, if you're going to vinyl, you might choose to send a higher bit depth, higher sample rate file. But for all the other platforms, that really isn't necessary. 16-bit 44.1 correctly dithered is a fantastic option. The third point is make sure you preview the results of your work. You might like to use the loudness penalty website. You might choose to do it in a different way, but take your final mastered results, maybe take a little bit of time again and compare it with other tracks that are similar in terms of genre, in terms of style and arrangement that you aspire to make your music sound like, and just double check one final time that they work in that situation, particularly when they're loudness matched. And the fourth point probably could be used to sum up the whole thing, really. In fact, the whole series of videos. And it's that I recommend you master as though your music were going to be released on vinyl. I've been working for over 25 years now in the mastering industry. And although I haven't done any vinyl cutting myself, we regularly send masters out to Abbey Road and to other top flight vinyl cutting houses. And we always get feedback saying they sound fantastic, we've cut them flat. That's probably not quite true. Most cutting engineers want to make some final little tweaks to optimize it for the format. But in terms of the loudness, the dynamics, the EQ balance, all the other things we've been talking about in these series, they work fantastically well on vinyl. So you don't have to make any special considerations. If you master with the thought that it would make a great vinyl record, and then you release that same sounding result on all of the digital platforms as well, you're going to get a fantastic result. And for some reason, I feel like that's quite a positive message to have these days. You know, I love vinyl. I love the big artwork and the sensation of dropping the needle into the groove, the physicality of the format, but the technical limitations of crackle and wow and fizz and surface noise, all of those kinds of things, they add a little flavor, but they always frustrated me. So the ideal for me is to get the vinyl sound, but released in a digital format. And that would be my suggestion to you if you want an overall recommendation. So I hope you found this series of videos useful and interesting. If you did, I think you will also love the free PDF that I've put together, the Home Mastering Guide. It covers the 6 steps that I think are essential to releasing your music with complete confidence. And it works really well with this series of videos as a way of summarizing and expanding on some of the points. If you'd like to get a copy, head over to homemasteringguide.com. It's completely free and I would love you to take a look at it. Please also subscribe to the Sound on Sound YouTube channel to make sure you get all of the other great content that they're releasing here. My name is Ian Shepherd. Thanks for listening.